Welcome to this episode of Breaking the Ice. I'm Jessica Shadian. I'm the president and CEO of Arctic 360 and one of the co-hosts of this summer's podcast series. Today, we're joined by Dr. Rebecca Pincus and Dr. Andrea Charron. Dr. Pincus is the director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Before becoming director, Dr. Pincus was a faculty member at the U.S. Naval War College in the Center for Naval Warfare Studies. She's also been a faculty member at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, where she focused on Arctic issues. Dr. Charron is the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies and a professor in political science at the University of Manitoba. She completed her PhD at the Royal Military College of Canada in the Department of War Studies. Dr. Charron has also worked for the federal government, including the Canadian Privy Council Office and the Security and Intelligence Secretariat. And Dr. Charron also happens to be a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. So, given the expertise of our two distinguished guests and two very leading experts that are also female, powerful women in the field, I would say, it should come as no surprise then that I was eager to have them come together to discuss today's conversation and topic on international maritime law and Arctic defense. Well, we know the US and Canada are very close allies, that should go without saying, and have a long history of Arctic cooperation. It spans everything from defense to infrastructure, the Arctic maritime, the environment, indigenous affairs, the list goes on. And that's not to say that there have never been differing opinions or disagreements throughout this history. So this includes in the area of international maritime law as it relates to the Arctic. So our conversation today as a starting point, as a jumping off point, is looking at last year's U.S. Department of State notice to the Federal Register documenting the limits of the U.S. continental shelf, which included the Arctic. Some of its boundaries overlap with Canada's own submission to UNCLOS, yet the bigger discussion for today is what the U.S. submission might mean in the context of this rapidly evolving Arctic geopolitical landscape, which itself is interconnected to a rapidly evolving global geopolitical landscape as well. But before we get into things, I want to let our co-hosts introduce themselves and let them start by taking it away. So I hand it over to you both.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. I'm Nazia Shah, joining from Toronto, where I'm pursuing a master's degree in global affairs at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Before this, I had the pleasure of studying international development at McGill University. I'm thrilled to be here today with all of you, and I can't wait to dive into this exciting and complex discussion alongside our incredible guests.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jaden Stevens. I'm from Norman Wells, Northwest Territories. I run a digital marketing company where I focus on storytelling about life in the North. I'm new to the Arctic advocacy field, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion with our guests. To start us off, Rebecca, could you share a bit about your background and your current role at the Wilson Center? What key areas have you focused on in the realm of U.S. and Arctic maritime security and geopolitics?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here. This is a terrific group, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I am currently the director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. The Wilson Center is a nonpartisan think tank, and it's a little unique in Washington because we are actually the presidential memorial for President Wilson. So we are a living memorial. And the Wilson Center is a foreign policy think tank with programs that span the globe. The Polar Institute has been in existence since 2017, so we're a relatively young program. And we're unique in Washington because we are the only program at a think tank that is full-time devoted to the polar regions, both the Arctic and Antarctica. And we are, again, we're nonpartisan, and we tackle a full span of policy issues and try to elevate issues that are either on or approaching the policy radar and both explain problems and identify solutions. Prior to coming to the Wilson Center, I was working within the U.S. federal government, primarily on security topics for the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. DoD. And so, over about a decade plus, I've been looking at Arctic security and strategic issues, and maritime issues that have been of particular importance across that time span include icebreaker acquisition, search and rescue, naval strategy, operational considerations, and a whole host of related issues. And it's been really interesting to watch the increase in attention to these issues over the last 10 or 15 years. Thanks.
My name's Andrea Charron. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba. My major area of research has always been on the North American Aerospace Defense Command. This brings in the Arctic because traditionally and still today, the Arctic Ocean has been the main avenue of approach were any adversaries to try and target cities or infrastructure in North America. Coupled with that Canada has the largest coastline in the world, and that is because of our Arctic archipelago, which is, very interesting geography, unlike any other country in the world. And Canada is also the second largest country in the world and is the second largest Arctic state in the world. And so for all these reasons, attention to the Arctic has always been a focus of my research.
Thank you both for sharing your insights and journey up to now. I'm just going to pick up on the topic of Arctic security and governance. So just as an opening here, in December 2023, the U.S. Department of State filed a notice to the Federal Registrar documenting the limits of the U.S. continental shelf, which included the Arctic. So just as a background, as defined by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS as we know it, the limits of a nation's continental shelf determines the extent of its extended continental shelf, which can then again extend beyond the standard 200 nautical miles from its coastline. We know that coastal states exercise sovereign rights over the established continental shelf for the purpose of exploring it and exploiting its natural resources on and below the seabed. Interestingly, though, the U.S. remains the only Arctic state that is not a party to UNCLOS, which sets the rules for defining continental shelves and their associated rights. So, Rebecca, this one is for you. Can you just give us some background and details about the overall U.S. Extended Continental Shelf Initiative, including its submission to the Federal Registrar? Hopefully, you could also touch upon the motivations and what the U.S. hopes to gain from making this unilateral submission. That would be great.
Sure, thank you. It's a great topic, and I will provide a quick encapsulation, but we'll also note that the Polar Institute has a collection of essays by a variety of experts on this topic. So if anyone is interested, just check out our website, and we've got, I think, almost a dozen different sets of analyses, which are quite valuable. So in December, the State Department released this announcement, as you note, and you also mentioned this extended continental shelf announcement is not just about the Arctic. It includes ECS areas in U.S. waters around the globe in the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Caribbean. So it's quite a sweeping announcement, but the Arctic component of it is the largest section. It's nearly 1 million square miles of territory lying north of the state of Alaska. And this announcement has been a long time in the making. The U.S. has been conducting scientific research on its extended continental shelf in the Arctic for decades. The ECS mapping project, of which the University of New Hampshire has been a leading participant, has worked with U.S. scientific agencies, the U.S. Coast Guard, as well as Canadian counterparts to conduct coring and sedimentary analysis and bathymetric research in the Arctic for well over 20 years, I think nearly 30 years. So a tremendous amount of effort has gone into the collection and analysis of this data. And the process by which the U.S. has collected data is fully in line with the requirements laid out in UNCLOS. And the U.S. made it very clear that it has adhered to UNCLOS technical requirements relating to the ECS in preparing its announcement. Now, the U.S. is not party to UNCLOS and therefore did not put a submission to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, the CLCS. But its announcement did note that it is prepared to, it has the submission prepared and will be able to submit that submission to the CLCS at such time as either the US joins and ratifies UNCLOS, or it is determined that submission by a non-party makes sense. And I think that's really, really interesting. The announcement notes that UNCLOS language does not, it talks about the ECS submissions as being conducted by coastal states, not by UNCLOS parties. And so the formulation, the use of coastal states indicates that you do not have to be a party to UNCLOS to claim an extended continental shelf. You simply have to be a coastal state. The US is a coastal state. My understanding is that the preparing of this announcement is an indication that the US was prepared to make a submission to CLCS on its coastal state status, but didn't do it at this time. So I think it's interesting to kind of think about the context here. Obviously, the CLCS is working through a backlog of submissions from other states. And so, I think perhaps it wasn't available to take submissions from non-parties. But, I think also this announcement is sort of the start of a process, because the delineation of extended continental shelves is something that is highly technical. When there are overlapping claims, obviously there has to be multilateral negotiations. And the CLCS rules on the scientific validity of claims, but does not actually adjudicate them. So there's really quite a complicated process, and so much of it is about sort of getting to a point of recognition by the international community that would be a basis for accepting sovereignty, and therefore being able to execute sovereignty through, for example, granting leases. If the sovereignty is in doubt, a business is not going to pay for a lease to territory if there's some questions about sovereignty. So much of this is about sort of getting to a place of validity and recognition. And I think this announcement is really a strong starting point there. Thank you.
Interesting to know that you do not have to be a party to UNCLOS to be able to make a submission. Thank you, Rebecca. We're going to shift our focus a bit to Canada. Andrea, Canada, as a party to UNCLOS, has submitted its claim to the Seabed Authority, which includes an overlapping boundary, just as Rebecca mentioned, of approximately 1 million square kilometers with the US in the Beaufort Sea. Canada was the only Arctic ally that responded, stating, I quote, "The Government of Canada will continue its efforts to obtain international recognition of the outer limits of Canada's extended continental shelf." So what is your general take on the implication of the US publication for Canada? Is Canada in a wait and see mode? Has it brought attention back to legal issues around the Northwest Passage and Canada's Arctic sovereignty?
Okay, well, I think we're conflating quite a few issues here. So I'm going to separate out the Northwest Passage because it really those are historic internal waters that have no bearing on any process to do with the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. So just to back it up a bit, Canada has made submission for our Atlantic coast and for our Arctic coast. So for our Atlantic submission, we're number 70 on the submission list. For the Arctic, we're number 84. And looking roughly at where the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf is in terms of creating committees to look at the submissions, et cetera, we're at about 46. So Canada has been and will continue to be in sort of a wait and see period. As Rebecca mentioned, Canada has, with the United States and with Denmark, engaged in collaborative research to be able to collect this information. In the case of the Arctic Ocean, Canada had more samples of rocks from the moon than we did to the Arctic Ocean floor until we started on this process of collecting the data and the evidence that's needed. And it's scientifically very, very advanced. And so regardless of whether a submission from the United States goes forward, I think the benefit to scientists and what we've learned about the Arctic Ocean floor has been a win. And so Canada, of course, has a number of managed disagreements with the United States, including the maritime boundary of the Beaufort Sea. And so before we even worry about whether or not a submission can go forward for the United States on the ocean floor, there's still that managed disagreement about where exactly the maritime boundary is in the Beaufort Sea. And that has far more implications in terms of future resource development, especially fish stocks, and looking at how to manage vessel traffic. So I think you're always going to see Canada paying more attention to that boundary than it will be to the ocean floor, if only because, you know, Canada's Arctic submission is long in the queue. I will note that the Commission has said we will not entertain any submissions that have overlapping claims. So it is going to come down, regardless of whether there's an official submission put forward or not. Canada and the United States are going to have a negotiation. The good news is through things like NORAD, through our Coast Guards, they have always managed to just agree to disagree, and they work together to make sure that those areas are secure, safe, surveyed, and we share information back and forth. So I think the reason why Canada had a very muted response was because there is no need to say anything more. This is going to be worked on by lawyers in the background with the UN about when and where appropriate the submission can go forward. In the meantime, there's a lot more we need to do. The final comment I will make is I'm sure in the back of US policymakers' minds is the fact that North America and NATO states are distinguishing themselves from adversaries as states that respect the rules-based international order. And so I think the US will be very careful about how any submission is seen by adversaries with that lens of a rules-based international order. And so I think that's why you've seen quite a cautious discussions about it. They have not, rammed it to the Secretary General to say, thou shalt look at this immediately. They're waiting as well to make sure that it's following along with the process.
I'm going to pick up a bit on this this last point, Andrea, and maybe even a bit from your introduction to that your answer about how kind of like the thing with the Northwest Passage having no bearing on the U.S. submission. So this past August, the U.S. Department of Defense cleared for open publication a paper, and it was titled "The U.S. Extended Continental Shelf Claim: The Case for a Counter Lawfare Strategy in the Arctic." So the paper focuses on actually closer to the area of both of your expertise. But it's on the intersection of international law, warfare, and national security. And through the concept of what the authors describe as lawfare, they define lawfare as the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve a war-fighting objective. So the paper then argues that lawfare provides an opportunity for competitors and adversaries of the U.S. to use legal narratives that weaken U.S. legitimacy. So one of the examples that the paper uses is how Russia uses lawfare as a part of a broader hybrid strategy by creating propaganda to manipulate and exploit public opinion about international law. And so the example provided is that Russia basically takes the straight baseline approach to claim that the Northern Sea Route is internal Russian waters, and it is the premise that Russia has set out to build its Northern Sea Route, which is essentially creating an Arctic shipping route between Europe and Asia that traverses Russia. So for our audience, who is less familiar, Russia's claim is that the Northern Sea Route is Russian internal waters based on the international legal argument of historical internal waters. On this side of the Arctic, Canada's own legal argument over the Northwest Passage is that the waters within, Canada's Arctic archipelago are Canadian internal waters, also based on the historic title. So anyways, the paper ultimately calls on the Department of Defense to develop a counter-lawfare communication strategy to combat what they see as actively taking place in the Arctic. So Canada and the US have historically placed cooperation over contention, both regarding the unresolved boundary in the Beaufort Sea, and have taken an agree to disagree stance on Canada's claims to the Northwest Passage as being internal waters. So Andrea, I'll just start with you. Maybe you could pick up a bit from the previous answers. So given the submission to the Federal Registrar on the limits of the Outer Continental Shelf, publications such as this DoD file document on lawfare, are we approaching some sort of new era? Do you think that maybe there should be some rethinking in Canada about how it intends to assert and protect its legal claims to Northwest Passage? Is the business as usual approach enough to ensure that cooperation and good relations between the U.S. and Canada persist?
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of problems with this line of questioning because it assumes that the Russian and the Canadian position are the same, and they have to be treated very differently. And that's the thing I would caution everybody. Things like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea try and take very funky geography and different situations around the world and come up with sort of a floor level set of rules that will work for the majority. But of course, there's going to be differences in terms of interpretation. The one thing I will say about Russia is it has to date, in an Arctic context, followed along with the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf process. They were the first to rush in their submission for the Arctic. The CLCS turned it away and said, no, this does not meet our scientific requirements. And rather than, walking away in a huff, they then doubled down and improved their submission. And many states around the world benefited from learning from them about the kind and quality of research one needed to make these submissions. I personally haven't heard Russia mention the historic part of their claim just based on geography. They are saying that it represents internal waters. And again, it's because of their geography. And they are actively soliciting commercial cargoes to use their northern sea route, provided that they have a Russian Coast Guard or other vessel to help guide them for a variety of purposes. That's Russia. In the case of Canada, nobody is questioning the Canadianness of the Northwest Passage. It's really about the rules that should apply. And based on Canada's characterization of our Northwest Passage as historic because of our Indigenous peoples, and especially the Inuit, who are a maritime peoples and have used the Northwest Passage for centuries, that's the historic part. And then the internal waters, because it represents channels within the Arctic archipelago. Other states, including the US, will say, well, your Arctic archipelago actually joins the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. Therefore, the rules that should apply are that it's an international strait. And therefore, rather than the current rules that apply, whereby any vessel, including Canadian vessels, that enter our Arctic waters have to have permission and have to ask to let us know we're there. We do that for a variety of reasons, mostly because the Arctic ecosystem is so fragile. When you have ships going through the Northwest Passage, they can have devastating impacts on both the coastal hamlets, but also all of the mammals that are in there. Because when a ship goes through and perhaps breaks the ice, then you can get whales or seals, they get caught in that ice and it freezes behind them, and then they're stuck there. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why Canada wants to know what vessels are up there, including for safety reasons. We have not managed to map the entire Northwest Passage, nor are we likely to. There are very few navigational aids, and often navigational aids that are there can get destroyed based on the amount of ice and current movement that happens up there. And so there are lots of reasons why Canada has those rules and regulations in place. We have a special agreement with the US Coast Guard so that we continue to agree to disagree. But I think, using the Russian position to juxtapose it against the Canadian position is an example of lawfare. And really, they have to be taken on their separate merits. Unique interpretations of law have been around for centuries, likely will be in the future. I think this is where the strength of the Canadian relationship means that we tend not to get caught up in that rhetoric, and there are, daily conversations between agencies, the State Department and Global Affairs Canada, to try and manage this. So far, we agree to disagree, and there's nothing to say that that can't continue.
Absolutely. That was a great answer. And I in no way was trying to put the two in the same bucket and say, well, if that, then this. But I just, I was reading through this paper, it just brought up questions about how things are interpreted and to what end. And we actually, on this issue that you were just discussing, our last conversation, actually, podcast was with Jackie Dawson from Canada and me Treadwell, and it was a fantastic conversation on precisely the issues around safety, security, and navigation that you were just mentioning, and how to strengthen U.S.-Canada cooperation and what we need to do to get there to ensure that that there is safe, secure shipping in the region. So, Rebecca, okay, obviously with all, with the submission, et cetera, the U.S., of course, is working in its interests. All states do that. Right? Canada is also a very close ally of the U.S. and critically a strategic partner, right, for NORAD, North American Arctic Security more broadly. So is there, I guess, a way to see these developments as a means or mechanism for strengthening ties between the U.S. and Canada? Or do you see them becoming a source of division? But if so, how might we avoid that path? How can we avoid that being something that transpires?
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, I absolutely think this is an opportunity because, as Andrea just noted so brilliantly, this is, there are these disagreements, but they take place in the context of a remarkably strong relationship. And nowhere is that relation. I mean, the proof of that is nowhere more evident than in NORAD. We have a binational military command. It's amazing. And I think, for a very long time, disagreements have sort of ticked along. You look at the maritime boundary dispute in the Beaufort, and it's just been sort of ticking along happily for decades. And it's really funny because that's sort of the major maritime disagreement in the Arctic. And so the idea that there's sort of nations fighting over boundaries, it's like, it's the United States and Canada. Obviously, we've had a long-standing disagreement about the Northwest Passage, and now you see this sort of ECS overlap. And I think, particularly on the US side, I will say that the Arctic has risen in salience dramatically in the last decade. And so there are more people, excuse me, there are more people coming into the policy space who do not have longstanding experience with these topics. So very often I talk with people who are tracking the Northern Sea Route and very concerned about that and are not even aware of what's happening on the other side. I have not seen the paper in question, but, I think there's a piece of it where there's sort of growing numbers of people involved, and this is an opportunity to educate them in a way that I think would be very helpful. To sort of add that context, add the history, bring in some more rich details, but also, I think having some forcing functions to drive more dialogue between the US and Canada on these issues will be valuable. Totally. Because again, in the absence of a crisis, business as usual will continue. And I think we have these these issue points that, again, they just sort of tick along, but at a certain point, it would be good to revisit them and to talk more directly. I think I do not believe in any way that the ECS claim was put out there with an intent of provoking the US-Canada relationship. I think the State Department felt comfortable making this claim, knowing there was overlap and knowing that there will be bilateral negotiations. Just as in the Beaufort Sea, we will come to an agreement. I mean, the contours of that agreement everyone sort of already knows them, right? But it just hasn't happened. So, I think we have these sort of longstanding irritant points, but more dialogue is better, and sort of having a reason to engage in that for it to slide up the agenda, I think is good. And honestly, to put these in context, I think the NORAD modernization question dominates the US-Canada relationship in the Arctic. And I think the rest of these are much more technical. So, in terms of sort of level of concern, I am not concerned, and I think in general it's sort of an opportunity to talk more about them, and solutions are at hand.
I would just add too that the lead organizations when it comes to an Arctic context for Canada and the US, I'm going to take out the air domain because that is the militaries by NORAD. But on the maritime side, it really is our Coast Guards. And our Coast Guards have a very, very close relationship. And I would add that the 17th District U.S. Coast Guard, which has the responsibility for in the Beaufort Sea and has a close relationship with the Russian Border Guard and with Canada's Coast Guard, they are talking to each other. They are connected through things like the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which seems to be thinking about, reinitiating with Russia. And the focus really is on safety and security. The other thing you're going to see is more conversations with Native Alaskans people and also the Canadian Indigenous peoples, because in an age of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they are rights holders, and they absolutely should be part of this conversation when it comes to boundaries.
That's a great point. And maybe I can piggyback on that to also say that, a lot of the ECS research was done cooperatively with US and Canadian scientists, the US and Canadian Coast Guard, and icebreaker support. This has been a very joint effort. So again, that's an indication that it's not, that wouldn't be happening if it was going to be creating problems in the relationship.
Right. I think I learned a lot today than my whole academic career. Let's step beyond the legal warfare perspective and kind of dive into the national interests surrounding critical minerals and mining. So we all know that the Beaufort Sea is rich in resources, and we're seeing rising geopolitical tensions, but I think Rebecca kind of mentioned how that plays between US and Canada. Recently, Norway actually became the first Northern European country to approve Arctic deep sea mining in the Svalbard archipelago. So Rebecca, beyond concerns about Russia and China, is the US's claim largely about securing rights and access to minerals and resources like gas in the Beaufort Sea, or is there another component to it?
No, I think it's sort of part of a long-standing project to finalize maritime boundaries. And again, it's a multi-decade research approach, so there's no single factor driving it. But the US, like all coastal states, wants to ensure that it's getting everything it is entitled to under international law. And, there are certainly a lot of resources up there. I don't think that there's a rush to I don't think we're seeing a rush to conduct deep sea mining in the Arctic, right? My understanding is that Norway has approved research and exploratory leases, not commercial leases yet. I may be wrong. Please correct me if that's wrong. But I think, we're seeing an industry that is really in its infancy, and the Arctic is one of the most costly and challenging places to operate in the maritime period. So, I think we've got some time before there will be viable seabed mining in the Arctic offshore. Again, we're talking about the extended continental shelf past 200 nautical miles. It is offshore. It is extremely challenging conditions. And so, I think obviously the US wants to sort of refine and finalize its claims. That is a first step, but it is a process. And it's just the first step in what would be a long, long process. And obviously, there are many competing interests in the Arctic. It's an area of top priority for environmental protection and conservation. So any movement to approve mining would be balanced against competing interests in protection and conservation. So, I think, the era is more viable, but it is certainly not something that would happen soon or without considerable additional effort.
Thank you. Sorry. Oh, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, in a Canadian context, the Canadian government has banned offshore oil and petroleum exploration in an Arctic context. That could change in the future, but I think many Western states are trying to get away from fossil fuel exploitation because it is antithetical to us meeting our climate change goals. This, incidentally, is a huge problem for Russia because 20% of its GDP comes from its Arctic and is mostly on the exploitation of fossil fuels. So there's a real disconnect between how Russia is going to meet any climate change goals and the public appetite for fossil fuel in the future. So that's a separate issue. Canada has in its Arctic, which is 40% of our land mass, we have some diamond mines, copper mines, gold mines, iron ore mines, starting to look at critical minerals. But of course, this is all also Indigenous homeland. And so again, it will be any future projects have to be with prior informed consent and negotiation with Indigenous rights holders. The other reality is, as Rebecca mentioned, it is so much more expensive to do any kind of mining or exploitation activity in the Arctic, especially Canada's Arctic, where there are very, very few roads. And so everything, people, materials, the resources, and the products that come out of the Arctic have to be either shipped in or out or flown in and out. And so I think this is why you see a big focus in Canada on what we call these small, quote unquote, lootable resources like gold and diamond. It doesn't take much to ship them because they're high value in a very concentrated amount. When it comes to critical minerals where you need lots of them, this is where all of a sudden the cost benefit analysis we have to think about because it doesn't make sense. The other thing Canada really lacks, and I'm hoping we get, is sort of a mineral strategy. Because in addition to the raw resources, it's about how you process the resources to be used by commercially by the public. And we've never really spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of processing industries and resources or capabilities we want in Canada. And so we tend to export our raw resources elsewhere, especially to the United States, which then turns them into products and turns it back to Canada for us to buy. So I think there's a larger conversation that needs to be had. But I think in an Arctic context, it really has to be with the rights holders. And it's because of the cost, this is going to be, slow as she goes.
Are you saying that we should have like an Arctic mineral strategy, or we have the critical mineral strategy? So I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think we need Canada lacks many strategies. We don't have a foreign policy. We don't have a national security strategy. We don't have an industrial strategy. Canada has an absence of guiding documents, unlike the U.S., which is done regularly to sort of update with latest thinking and geopolitical conditions. I'm saying that Canada generally needs to think about mineral resources and strategies for all of Canada, not just necessarily in an Arctic context.
I'm glad that you mentioned the environmental aspect, Andrea, and the highlight of roads, as well as the cost and benefit analysis that we really need to take into consideration. I'm just going to dive into the broader role of governance in managing these competing interests. So, Andrea, in your recent co-authored article that was on the nuanced futures of Canadian and U.S. defense, the potential for the Arctic Council to help manage state competition in the region was briefly discussed. In what way do you see the Arctic Council playing a role in addressing the discussions around the extended outer continental shelf, ECS?
Well, they really have none. I mean, the Arctic Council, which is a Canadian creation, has two mandates. That's environmental protection and sustainable development in an Arctic context. It is a intergovernmental forum. It's not hard law. It's not by a treaty. It was created by a declaration. So the real promise of the Arctic Council is to have consensus among the 8 Arctic states and with the permanent Indigenous participants. And so my hope is that there are conversations that happen in an Arctic Council context that can really benefit discussions outside of an Arctic Council purview. I note, however, the Arctic Council, which only celebrated its 25th anniversary in 2021, immediately in 2022, the 7 Arctic states decided to put it on hiatus, and they did that without consultation with the permanent participants. And then there was the decision to restart the Arctic Council with Russia, again, not in consultation with the permanent participants. So I think, the Arctic Council is slowly coming back online. It's working with Russia on online consultation, not in person. But we need a bit of a reset and to remember the foundations of the declaration, which was that, the permanent participants have to be part of the discussion. They can't be informed of decisions made by the Arctic states after the fact.
Let's jump into what this all means from the perspective of the North and Northern communities. Rebecca, in terms of Alaska and Canada, where do Northern communities play into these discussions? For example, have Native Alaskan communities played a role in the U.S. Continental Shelf Initiative as co-authors or collaborators?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I would almost steer back to the Arctic Council in our most recent discussion because it's, as Andrea has noted, it's a remarkable forum for engaging with Northern communities and Indigenous peoples. And, the Arctic Council includes member states, but also 6 permanent participants, which are Arctic Indigenous organizations. That is a remarkable. The permanent participants sit at the table with nation states on an equal footing. They participate in conversations on an equal footing. They don't have a vote, but they are co-equal representatives. And I think that is one of the most remarkable accomplishments of the Arctic Council, and it's really special in a global context. And so, in that perspective, Arctic Indigenous peoples play a tremendous role in Arctic governance. When it comes to the ECS announcement, I think there was sort of a different process. But for so many issues within the purview of the Arctic Council, Arctic Indigenous peoples play a really significant role. And, I think that's been a remarkable arc. I think Andrea also highlighted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which helped sort of elevate these issues. And I think, on any question going forward for the future of the Arctic, within the purview of the Arctic Council, Arctic Indigenous peoples will be an important part of the conversation and a really significant set of stakeholders. I will say that the political position of Arctic Indigenous peoples between the U.S. and Canada is quite different. So the structure, the sort of post-colonial structure of empowering Indigenous people has been practiced very, very differently. In the United States, the Alaska Native land claims were settled through an agreement that created Native corporations, which are outside of the political structure of the state of Alaska, but very, very influential. We can talk about that a bit. In Canada, the process has been very, very different. And so I think you see some differences between the US and Canada structurally, but the sort of net position is the same in that Arctic Indigenous peoples are important and influential politically and have a growing and really significant voice at this point in decisions about the Arctic.
And I would just add, sorry, that, the Arctic Council has an agreement, which the 8 Arctic states signed on to, and it's still in force, that any sort of scientific research that happens in an Arctic context is to include Indigenous peoples, because those different ways of knowing, both the scientific method but also Indigenous knowledge, really improves our understanding of the Arctic.
Rebecca, if you wanted to, so the National Science Foundation, right, in the United States has a polar program, and there is a long history of collaboration on science between, let's say, Native Alaskans and scientists, other researchers, et cetera. But so I don't know if you have any specific examples related to kind of the ongoing research related to the Outer Continental Shelf that you wanted to bring up, or.
Sure. I mean, the NSF, the National Science Foundation, just released a new policy, I think earlier this year or late last year, mandating that, any funding for Arctic projects must require the, prior consent, informed consent of Arctic Indigenous peoples. So any scientific research that affects Arctic Indigenous peoples lands or interests must have their written consent before getting NSF funding. And that's a really significant illustration of the consideration that I think is going into these decisions.
Yeah, likewise, in Canada, the Canadian federal government now has a 5% clause. So any sort of capital projects that take place in the Arctic have to have, at least 5% of the contract is for Indigenous peoples. So, for example, the North Warning Systems, which NORAD relies heavily on, it is an Indigenous Inuit majority-owned company Nassitut, which won the contract for their maintenance, and that's in part because of requirements to consider Indigenous contracts.
Yeah, and the U.S. government also has similar sort of contracting obligations to give preference to small and minority-owned businesses and Native-owned communities. Yeah.
Yeah, just for some context for our listeners, Canada has its own land claim agreements with the Inuit, including offshore rights, such as granting Inuit control over resources including oil, gas, and fisheries beyond the coast. The Nunavut Land Claims Agreement outlines Inuit land ownership, resource rights, and self-governance of over approximately 2 million square kilometers. A big piece of Canada's argument for the historical title relates to the fact that the Inuit have inhabited the area predating the arrival of Europeans. And so, Rebecca, the ICC represents Inuit of Alaska, Canada, Russia, and Greenland. Has the ICC been involved in this conversation or in this U.S. discussion?
The U.S. ECS discussion? I have to say,
ICC.
I cannot comment on the extent to which the State Department interacted with the ICC during their consultations. That's not information I'm privy to. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Okay. Or I guess even in the research or this has been ongoing for a long time. So maybe just if there's been conversations with ICC, even from the Canadian perspective on kind of these issues. So, yeah.
Yeah, again, in terms of the ICC in particular, as opposed to the Canadian National Institution, which is the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, I can't tell you specifically who has been involved. But, one thing to note is that the ICC was seeking observer status on the International Maritime Organization. I'm really hoping that continues. It makes sense. They are maritime peoples. I'd like to see more states support their observership in the future.
Yeah.
And I should note that, just real quick before both the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guard have tremendous contact with their Arctic Indigenous communities. So from an operational perspective, there's certainly an enormous amount of transparency about operations, what ships are coming up, where they're going, when, there's an enormous amount of effort to deconflict ship operations with, hunting seasons and all that kind of thing. And so, on the substance, I can't comment on sort of the legal substance, but on the operational side, all this research activity was very certainly, conducted with an enormous level of transparency and coordination with Alaska Natives. Again, I don't know, I can't comment on the ICC specifically, but in terms of sort of Alaska Native outreach, the District 17, the U.S. Coast Guard District 17 has a very great working relationship with those communities on the operational side.
Yeah, likewise, the Canadian Coast Guard has actually made it sort of a rule, maybe too strong a word, but rather than having new people coming up all the time, they identify people who want to operate in the Arctic, so they get to grow those relationships. And we have something called the auxiliary program, where Indigenous youth have longboats, and they are helping to patrol with the Coast Guard. And so you really see the Coast Guard as one of the lead organizations, especially in the summer context, working with Arctic inhabitants. And, I think that the goal is to share more domain awareness information, because certainly local peoples see and hear things that need to get passed on to federal agencies, and vice versa. One of the common complaints is we're a local small hamlet, fewer than 300 people, and we didn't get any sort of warning about a cruise ship that is coming. And that has implications for, how much artwork they have ready to sell, if their supplies get used up by people on the ship, et cetera, the impact that bow waves have on the integrity of the shoreline and things like that. So you're seeing more conversations with local inhabitants and these federal agencies.
Yeah, I will just say, in both the U.S. and Canada, there is so much collaboration going on. And I know that the ICC is also very active on the international scene. And our intention was actually to have ICC part of this discussion. So I completely understand that and don't expect for you guys to specifically comment on them, but they are important actors in the space. So we thought we'd try to bring them in as best we can.
So that's very interesting. Thank you for that. I'm just going to go back a little bit about what we discussed about lawfare. I was just going to say that this is only one component of the defense conversation. We're going to widen out a bit and look at some of the more conventional pieces of the puzzle. So in addition to the current geopolitics unfolding within the Arctic, as we all know, there's also this growing interest in the region's maritime resources, which you've already mentioned. Non-Arctic states such as China have increased their presence in the Arctic with icebreaking research vessels conducting scientific expeditions, giving them better access to data. This summer, for example, China, for the first time, dispatched 3 ice-breaking vessels into the Arctic region. We also see China and Russia undertaking joint military exercises in the Arctic. So starting off with you, Andrea, what do you see as the current state of the U.S.-Canada maritime cooperation in the North American Arctic? Let's talk a little bit about NORAD and its relationship to NATO as regards to the broader geopolitics unfolding in the region.
Yeah, so Canada and the US, I think, have sort of a seamless relationship when it comes to the air domain, and that's largely because of NORAD. On the maritime domain, it tends to get a little bit more stovepiped, and that's often because of the agencies, the jurisdiction they have, and the mandates they have. So, for example, there's very, very close coordination between the U.S. Coast Guard and the Canadian Coast Guard, but then do we have the same close relationship between the navies and the Coast Guards and the Transport Canada and the equivalent in the U.S.? I think that's where I'd like to see more of that integration, especially in a Arctic context, because it is it's a more difficult operating environment. NORAD has a maritime warning mission. I think it could be used to more effect. I think it's often forgotten about, and I think especially in an Arctic context, this is where things could get interesting. When it comes to NORAD modernization, we are putting in more space-based, land-based, maritime-based surveillance, and certainly we'll be sharing that information. But NORAD traditionally and maritime efforts with the Canadian Coast Guard and US Coast Guard and the like tend to do things over here in North America. NATO does stuff over here. And what you're starting to see is we're linking efforts. And a large part of that is because now we have a NATO Joint Forces Command Norfolk based in Virginia that's twinned to the Second Fleet. And they have a similar area of concern, which is the Northern Arctic, the Northern Atlantic and the Arctic. We're seeing closer coordination between the combatant commands in the U.S. system to actually start sharing information. They have something called the Global Information Dominance Exercise, which actually forces commanders in different combatant commands to talk to each other. For the US, they have such a funky system in the Arctic because they have 3 geographic commands, plus then they have what they call their functional commands, for transportation and the like. So often I find allies are trying to work within the bounds of these US combatant commands, which can get a bit complicated. But all this to say, I think it's a work in progress. And it's because, especially in a North American context, I think Canada and the US have finally realized how vulnerable we are. We often thought that the best way to defend North America is to send everybody, our militaries, away and fight adversaries far away from North America. And we now realize that, well, that leaves us very vulnerable because our key critical infrastructure and many of our assets that we would need in an overseas context are sitting in North America. And unless we have eyes on what's going on and we have a defeat plan, then we can be undone quite quickly. The final thing I will say is that I think you're starting, especially in the context of NORAD modernization, it really is a fundamental rethink of what it means to defend North America. And so it can't just be in an air domain. It really must be in all of the domains. And that's going to mean more organizations and agencies and countries, including an independent Greenland in the future, working together to make sure there are no seams of jurisdiction that can be exploited by adversaries.
Right. It's important to make use of your resources. Rebecca, why don't you weigh in on this with your thoughts if you have any?
Yeah, I mean, Andrea did a great job, I think, talking about sort of the NORAD and the NATO side. And I think it's it's important to see the Arctic in sort of a global context, right? In which, there is sort of a global competition going on right now, and our competitors are looking at a global chessboard in terms of finding pressure points. And, I think it's not surprising that China is sending research icebreakers to the Arctic because the US does not have enough icebreakers. So that is a point that it should poke at. It's one of our weak points. It's entirely rational. I don't ascribe to it sort of really significant intent beyond that, because I think from a Chinese perspective, the Arctic, while of interest, is not a top priority. Certainly China's top priorities are its regional seas. Do I think, Chinese research icebreakers are the step before China's attempt to seize territory in the Arctic? No, I don't. I think it is signaling to the United States that it has more icebreakers than we do, and that's embarrassing. And so okay, 1 point China, message taken. Similarly, the US's major competitive advantage in the world is its network of allies and partners, right? And, Canada's at the top of that list. Point at NATO. And, the US talks so much about its allies and partners. And we show them off. We have great, multilateral exercises. We have NATO exercises. We do bilateral exercises with Canada in the Arctic. So it makes sense that China and Russia are going to do stuff together. Hey, look, we have friends too, right? I mean, that is, again, it's entirely sort of rational activity. Their air and naval exercises in the Arctic are not very sophisticated. We should note, okay, you can drive ships side by side in the Bering Sea. The level of complexity in NATO and allied exercises is at another level, right? I mean, and I think we shouldn't treat them as equivalent. In terms of sort of military cooperation between Russia and China, we see some indications, but I think, again, I would largely bucket those. Well, there's a couple, I mean, this is a longer conversation, right? Obviously, China is supplying a significant amount of dual use hardware to Russia that is supporting its war effort in Ukraine. China is the largest customer of Russian hydrocarbons, which provides funding for the war. And, we see sort of statements about a no limits friendship. We see the Coast Guard agreement. But in terms of sort of really deep level military cooperation, we don't see that yet. Obviously, that would be a really, really concerning point if they got to a point of a military alliance, if we saw really, really closely synced up military activity. But there is, obviously a fair amount of friction in that relationship as well. And so I think, largely reading those Arctic operations and joint operations from China and Russia as signaling, I think is a good starting point. And again, as Andrea noted, we have to tighten up our own capabilities in the Arctic. And I think that's where the new US national strategy for the Arctic and the new US DoD Arctic strategy point to those capabilities as critically important. But I always get a little bit concerned when it's sort of, when sort of the idea that China is coming for the Arctic gets put out there, because I think I would put it in a global context and think about how China's sort of interests and the sort of costs and benefits of Arctic operations, what that means for China.
I would just add, I mean, where Canada really benefits is because the US, through the adoption of its strategies and policies, really helps us with the language. And there are two areas I think we still need to improve on. One is that while we as allies have very sophisticated Arctic exercises, it's not uncommon to have the US will have Arctic Edge and Canada will have Operation Nanook and NATO in Norway will have Cold Response. And never do we sort of communicate whether or not these things are linked, or if we have a wider strategic message we want to send with the fact that we happen to have these Arctic exercises in close, not necessarily geographic proximity, but from a timing perspective. And so I'd like to see us all think about that, what's our wider strategic messaging. And the other thing is that you've noted that the US has stopped repeating that China is a near Arctic state, because that creates, and this goes back to lawfare, that's creating a third category, a special category for China. And the fact is there are two categories only. There are Arctic states and there are non-Arctic states. And so I really appreciate that about the US and their documents. They're very thoughtful about how they're naming potential adversaries, that Russia is a proximate, persistent threat. That's helpful to Canada because we don't seem to be able to articulate that very well. And that China, as Dr. Pincus rightly pointed out, this is what they call the pacing threat, and it really is in an Indo-Pacific and then global context. This pacing threat is not first and foremost in an Arctic context. So those documents are really, really helpful.
That's excellent. I have 15 questions that I could be asking both of you, but I want to try to get somewhere towards wrapping up. This has just been a fantastic conversation. Kind of just reaffirms that I knew the two of you need to come together to have a discussion on this topic, because you're both just full of fantastic insights, expertise. So if we can kind of think, I always like to end the conversation on a bit of an optimistic note, hopefully. And so I guess my last question for both of you is, and I'm not trying to say you have to answer it this way, but because I want to end on the optimistic note, but generally speaking, Are you optimistic or pessimistic kind of about the future of the region? Are we heading in a direction of cooperation or more competition? And what can we be doing? And I think both of you have highlighted some points on this to ensure that we actually continue down a path of cooperation.
Well, I am quite optimistic, and generally I'm not an optimistic person. I'm sort of the glass is half empty and poisoned. So in an Arctic context, though, I actually see a lot of benefits. There are a couple of things, though, I'm watching for. So, for example, in the Arctic Council context, Western states will now dominate the chairship of the Arctic Council until 2034, I believe. And so we need to be careful about what sort of message that sends to Russia. The fact is they are the largest Arctic state. They have the most to lose in an Arctic context if it becomes, a lawless region. I think the likelihood of any sort of conflict in or about the Arctic is going to be because there's been an accident, a misperception, or some sort of misunderstanding that precipitates activity quite quickly. And so it's really important that we find avenues for conversation that includes the permanent participants, and that we keep lines of communication open in an Arctic context, because things can go so badly wrong so quickly. And that's because the Arctic Ocean is strategically a quick avenue to any state in the world, really. So we've got to make sure that the rules-based international order prevails. And again, watching the rhetoric about how we talk about China and Russia and other states in an Arctic context, I think is going to be more important than ever in the future.
I think I would have to sort of categorize my levels of sort of optimism or pessimism, because what we haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about is climate change. And obviously the world is on a pathway of increasing emissions. And I'm trying to be optimistic, but we are running out of time, particularly in the Arctic region. It's already, there are parts of the Arctic that are over 4 degrees. So the region is going through a catastrophic meltdown, and we are running out of time to do anything about it, and we don't seem to be willing to do those things. And I'm gravely concerned about that. And I think, in sort of the other set of things, in terms of cooperation on sort of other types of activities, I think I'm pretty optimistic, because, while there's a tremendous sort of narrative out there that climate change is opening up the Arctic, in many ways, it's making it harder and more costly to operate, whether offshore because of increasing navigational hazards, or onshore because of degrading permafrost and coastal erosion. It is not easy to go up into the Arctic and do things. And I think that is always going to, put the brakes on some of the more optimistic or, more sort of high activity scenarios, leaving room for cooperation. But, if global emissions do not change soon, or if new technologies for carbon capture or whatever it is do not come on board soon, the Arctic, as we know it, will be gone. We'll probably see an Arctic Ocean that is free of summer sea ice within a decade. We're already seeing just catastrophic climate impacts across the board. And, I could list them out for another hour. And the costs are just going to go up. And quite frankly, national budgets cannot absorb all the costs. There is not enough money in the system for all of the climate adaptation that needs to happen. And I'm gravely concerned about that. And I really sincerely hope that we see, a paradigmatic change with regards to our approach to climate very, very soon.
Yeah, both of those answers were fantastic. And bringing up extremely important points, because words do matter. In that way, perhaps there's a greater need now for more expertise in the region to make sure that how things are talked about and discussed, which get out into the open very quickly, are based on sound research and data and information. And in that way, also from those inside the Arctic and doing Arctic, let's say even diplomacy, communication is key and how we communicate. And it could be used to strengthen really collaboration and cooperation, like we were discussing in terms of strengthening partnerships, but it also can be used to undermine, as we've seen with this, these other ideas, to undermine and sow discord, as we see going on elsewhere all over the world. And interestingly enough, this issue, we did not really talk about climate change at all. And what's also quite, it's just thing about, well, absolutely, the whole discussion starts and, ends with climate change. And in the middle becomes this piece about greater interest to the region for access to those minerals that are going to help then also with the transition to the net zero economy. And so it's for how do we better be able to talk about these two things at the same time, because it seems right now in a world of heightened geopolitical tensions, the entire discussion of climate change has just slid off into the ocean. And now it's about pending war here, there, and everywhere else. And so how do we then try to navigate that, especially within the Arctic, because where climate change has, is affecting the world the most, we need to be able to actually have both of those conversations at the same time. So I guess it's figuring that out. And that's where the Arctic Council does play a really important role, because it is a way to elevate those conversations, communicate to the world the facts, information, and data that the world needs to learn and better understand about what's going on in the Arctic, the role of the Arctic in the world, how the Arctic impacts the rest of the world, but how the world is also impacting the Arctic. So I want to thank you both. This has been a fantastic conversation. It's great. I hope we have an opportunity to pick up on it. I really liked, Rebecca, that you mentioned at the beginning at one point saying that we need to have more sustained, ongoing discussion on these topics. And I think that would be something that we should figure out how we can be doing more of that, because I think that's key. Because what we're doing is trying to educate general people about what's going on in the Arctic. So thank you both.
As a reminder, the views expressed in this podcast are the views of the participants alone and do not represent the views and opinions of Arctic 360, the Munk School of Global Affairs, or any other government or agency. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to Breaking the Ice. Follow Arctic 360 on social media to stay up to date on all the latest podcast episodes and Arctic 360 content. You can find us on all streaming platforms, LinkedIn, and Twitter, or you can visit our website at arctic360.org. Thank you for listening. This is Breaking the Ice.